Now let's turn to the PPPLF. SRIYA, I think you're on, so the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Greg. Okay, so this work is joint with Mark Carlson and Mary Frances Tazinski, who are both at the board with me. And before I begin, the views expressed in this talk are ours and not those of the Federal Reserve Board. And the first thing before I wanted to start the presentation is I wanted to thank the conference organizers for accepting the paper into the program, and we are very eager to get all the comments from the audience today. Okay, so Padma already did an excellent job of talking about what the Paycheck Protection Program was, in addition to Governor Bowman. So I am just going to say that I think many researchers have found that the program was successful. And so today we're going to be looking at the Paycheck Protection Program in another angle. We're going to be looking at the Paycheck Protection Program Liquidity Facility, or the PPPLF, which Padma also mentioned in her presentation. And this facility was established by the Federal Reserve to bolster banks' ability to make PPP loans. So in this paper, we ask if this facility, the PPPLF, was indeed successful at boosting PPP lending by commercial banks. And we found, which wrong way, that the answer is yes. The banks that use the facility, they made nearly twice more PPP loans relative to banks that did not use the facility. And so our crude back of the envelope calculations suggest that this is an additional $53 billion of PPP loans issued. And given that we're looking really at the first 3 months of that the PPP program started, where take up for the first 2 rounds was around 525 billion, we do feel that this additional 53 billion is quite meaningful. We find that the facility boosted PPP lending more for small community banks. And so these are going to be banks with assets of less than $600 million. And that boost came right about at the start of the pandemic, which was April 2020. And the last part of the paper, we think about the role that the facility might have played as a backstop. And this is the idea that because there was some certainty that the facility provided in terms of cheap funding for many banks, some banks might have changed how they gave PPP loans because of the presence of the facility. And so we find evidence that some banks did think of the facility as a backstop, in particular large community banks. And so these are going to be banks with assets of greater than $600 million. And so we find that these banks issued nearly 50% more PPP loans because of the facility's presence, but they didn't actually borrow from the facility itself. And so our back of the envelope calculations suggest that this is about an additional $15 billion of PPP loans. So I'm going to skip over the slide about the Paycheck Protection Program since it's already been so well described and go right into the specifics of the Paycheck Protection Program Liquidity Facility. So the facility was introduced by the Fed a mere 6 days after the first PPP loan was issued, and that's April 9th. And it was first established to commercial banks. Now, if a bank wanted to borrow from the facility to fund a PPP loan, they could borrow from this facility and the maturity of that loan would match the PPP loan. So that's going to be either 2 years or 5 years. There's no duration risk if you use this facility. In addition, the facility was cheap. The loans were only at 35 basis points. So for a 2 or a 5 year loan, I think that's a bargain. And on average, we know that it was cheaper than FHLB funding, Federal Home Loan Bank funding, which usually is the most common source of external funding for many of the banks in our sample. So if a bank chose to borrow from the facility, the amount of the loan would equal the amount of the PPP loan. And quite nicely, the bank could just use the PPP loan as collateral for the PPPLF loan. Now, there was some ongoing monitoring that was required by banks. So if the Small Business Administration, the SBA, forgave the PPP loan, then the bank would have to pay back that PPPLF loan. And like all other Federal Reserve facilities, banks had to submit the paperwork before they became eligible to borrow from the Paycheck Protection Program liquidity facility, which will become a little bit more important when I talk about how we answer this question of whether the facility did increase PPP lending by banks. So here's a little bit about the data. we identify 4,225 commercial banks as PPP lenders, and we use the FFIEC call report as of June 30th, 2020, which provides a snapshot. And in that call report, it asks respondents to report their participation in the PPP. So of those 4,225 banks that we identify as PPP lenders, we find that 743 borrowed from the facility between its inception on April 9th, 2020 and June 30th, 2020, which is when our snapshot of the PPP loans that we get from the June 30th call report. So here are some summary statistics about banks that use the PPP split by if they borrowed from the facility versus not. So in the column N, you can see the 743 banks that I mentioned earlier. Those are the banks that use the facility. And then by construction, 3,482 did not. So if you sum up those two numbers, you get the 4,225 banks in our sample. So our main dependent variable of interest, the outcome variable that we're looking at here, is essentially just PPP loans divided by assets. So we can see on average, if the bank borrowed from the PPPLF, 17% of total assets are PPP loans. But for 4 of those banks, this ratio is actually greater than 1. So this are going to be like Cross River or WeBank. And these banks were known to have helped a lot of fintechs finance loans, PPP loans through the PPPLF. So after removing those banks with a ratio of greater than 1 from our sample, because we don't feel like their business model is representative of most small banks or most banks that are using the PPPLF, we arrive at a ratio of 0.11, so 11% of total assets are going to be PPP loans. Now, looking at banks that did not borrow from the PPPLF, if we look at the adjusted line, which is again removing those banks with a ratio greater than 1, we see that only 5% of the total assets are PPP loans. So as I mentioned earlier, I told you that banks that borrowed from the facility issued more PPP loans than banks that did not. And I always like it when the summary statistics sort of work out that way too. You can see here that banks that borrowed from the facility just on average had more PPP loans on their balance sheet than banks that did not borrow. So, but one thing I haven't really talked about is how we identify whether or not the PPPLF indeed had a causal impact on banks' PPP lending. And this question is hard to answer. And the best way is just to give an example. So suppose you found that banks that borrowed from the facility did actually increase their bank's PPP lending. But you wouldn't know if it was the facility that made the bank increase their PPP lending or if there was something special about the bank to begin with that made them increase their PPP lending. And so to circumvent this obstacle and trying to identify the facility's impact on PPP lending, we use what's called as an instrumental variable approach, or an IV. And in order to do an IV, you need a variable that predicts whether or not the bank will use the facility, but that has no bearing whatsoever on how many PPP loans they might issue. And so that variable that we pick, our instrumental variable, is what we call a bank's familiarity with the discount window. And we measure this instrumental variable, this familiarity, by whether or not the bank had pledged loan collateral to the discount window. The bank had signed up to use the discount window. That doesn't mean they necessarily borrowed, but in order when you sign up and you're prepared to use it, you have to tell the Fed what collateral you're going to use, and many banks use loans. And since the process of signing up for the discount window and that act of pledging loan collateral was nearly identical to the same process of pledging a PPP loan as collateral to the PPPLF, we argue that there is a very clear mechanism that if a bank is already familiar with the administrative process of how to pledge loan collateral, that would have made banks much more likely to consider the PPPLF as funding and should have no bearing on actually how many PPP loans they issued. So here are some summary statistics about banks that were familiar with the discount window and how they used the PPPLF and did not. So of the 4,225 banks in our sample, we find that 233 were familiar with the discount window and they borrowed from the PPPLF. These 233 banks had loan collateral pledged to the discount window. That's how we measure familiarity. However, 531, they were familiar, but they did not borrow from the facility. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we also look at this angle of how the facility might have acted as a backstop. And so we think about a backstop as by looking at if the bank signed up to use the PPPLF. And so this is what we mean by PPPLF docs on file. So these are banks that signed up to use the facility, but they may not have actually borrowed. And so we find that 445 were familiar with the discount window. They knew how to pledge loan collateral to the discount window, and they also signed up to use the PPPLF. Whereas 319 were familiar with the discount window, but did not actually sign up to use the PPPLF. And so our main results show that if a bank borrowed from the PPPLF, on average, they increased their PPP lending by 6.4 percentage points, which is about twice more loans in comparison to banks that did not borrow. And we find that our instrumental variable nicely works, that indeed this familiarity with the discount window does actually predict whether or not the bank borrows from the PPPLF. And as I mentioned earlier, we find this effect to be the strongest for small community banks. So these again are going to be banks of assets less than $600 million. Those banks that borrowed from the facility, they increased their PPP lending by 9.5 percentage points. So in the last part of the paper, we think again about this role as a backstop. And so again, this is the idea that did the banks change the amount of PPP loans they extended because of the certainty of funding the PPPLF provided? These banks may never have actually borrowed from the PPPLF, but still might have changed how they extended PPP loans. And we find that large community banks in particular thought of the PPPLF as a backstop. They increased their PPP lending by 3.4 percentage points, so that's about 50% more PPP loans, because of the certainty of the funding that the PPPLF provided. These banks didn't actually necessarily borrow from the facility. So we conclude in the paper that this is evidence that some banks thought of the PPPLF as a backstop. So in conclusion, we find that the PPPLF was effective in the sense that it did bolster PPP lending by banks, by commercial banks. In particular, the PPPLF, those that borrowed from the PPPLF extended twice more PPP loans than banks that did not borrow. That effect is strongest for the small community banks, and some banks thought of the facility as a backstop because we find that large community banks that did not necessarily borrow from the facility, they also increased their PPP loans by 50%. And that concludes my remarks. Thank you so much for the time.
Thanks so much, Shreya.